Critics love to act like gatekeepers of greatness. But what if some of the most iconic science fiction films ever made were buried because critics simply did not understand them? Not misjudged, not overlooked, completely misunderstood. These films were dismissed, while weaker films were praised. That is not just a mistake. That is a failure of judgment. And decades later, these so-called failures are now the very films redefining the genre. Number 10, Akira, 1988. It did not fail because it was weak. It failed because audiences were not ready. When this explosive anime hit Western screens, it left critics confused and often dismissive. They saw chaos where there was structure. They saw noise where there was meaning. What they missed was a seismic shift in how science fiction could look and feel. Set in a shattered Neo-Tokyo, this film does not guide you gently. It throws you into a collapsing world of psychic power, political unrest, and identity breakdown. The narrative feels overwhelming on first watch, and that is exactly why early critics rejected it. They expected clarity. What they got was intensity without compromise. But time changed everything. Filmmakers studied it, animators borrowed from it, entire genres evolved because of it. The visual language alone reshaped global animation standards. Its themes about power, control, and human evolution now feel disturbingly relevant. What critics once labeled messy is now understood as layered storytelling. What they dismissed as excess is now seen as vision. Today, this film stands as one of the most influential science fiction works ever created. Not just in animation, in all of cinema. Number 9. RoboCop, 1987. At first glance, critics thought they understood it. A violent action film about a cyborg cop. Brutal, loud, excessive. That was the verdict. But that reading missed the entire point, completely. Beneath the Blood and Metal is one of the sharpest satirical attacks on corporate greed ever put on screen. This is not just a story about a man turned into a machine. It is about a society that has already become one. Dehumanized, controlled, sold piece by piece. Early reviews focused on the violence because it was impossible to ignore, but that distraction blinded them to the deeper machinery underneath. Every exaggerated news broadcast, every corporate slogan, every moment of dark humor was deliberate. This film was holding up a mirror, and critics laughed instead of looking. Over time, the narrative flipped. Viewers began to see the satire clearly. The film's critique of privatization, media manipulation, and identity erosion became impossible to dismiss. What once felt excessive now feels precise. Today, it stands as a perfect fusion of action and intellect. A film that entertained while dissecting the system around it. Critics did not just misunderstand it, they underestimated it. Number 8. They Live, 1988. The message was never subtle, and that is exactly why critics rejected it. When this film arrived, it was labeled simplistic, even ridiculous. A wrestler wearing sunglasses fighting aliens hiding among humans. That was the surface, and many never looked beyond it. But beneath that simplicity lies a ruthless critique of consumer culture and invisible control. The concept is brutally direct. The world is manipulated. The truth is hidden in plain sight, and only those willing to see can break free. Critics at the time wanted sophistication. They wanted complexity wrapped in elegance. What they got instead was a hammer, direct, unapologetic, relentless, and they dismissed it for that reason. Years later, the film feels less like fiction and more like warning. The iconic imagery of hidden messages and controlled perception has only grown stronger with time. What once felt exaggerated now feels eerily accurate. The film did not fail to communicate. It communicated too clearly. That clarity made critics uncomfortable. Today, it is recognized as one of the boldest pieces of social science fiction ever made. A film that refused to whisper when it needed to shout. Number 7, The Abyss, 1989. It was called uneven, overlong, emotionally confused. That was the early verdict. Critics saw a film that could not decide what it wanted to be. A deep-sea thriller, a love story, a first contact narrative. They thought it lacked focus. What they missed was something far more deliberate. This film is not about one idea. It is about pressure. Physical pressure crushing the human body and emotional pressure breaking the human mind. Set in the darkest depths of the ocean, it traps its characters in isolation, where fear and desperation begin to distort reality. The tension builds slowly, and that slow burn frustrated critics who expected immediate spectacle. The theatrical cut only made things worse. Key story elements were removed, which left the ending feeling abrupt and disconnected. Critics judged an incomplete version, and the damage was done. But when the extended version surfaced, everything shifted. Suddenly, the emotional arc made sense. The alien presence became meaningful. The message became clear. Now it is recognized as one of the most technically ambitious films of its time, groundbreaking underwater filmmaking, early digital effects that pushed boundaries, and at its core, a deeply human story about trust, sacrifice, and connection under impossible conditions. What critics once dismissed as unfocused is now seen as layered. What they called flawed is now understood as compromised by editing. This film was not confused. It was misunderstood because it was never seen as it was meant to be seen. Number 6. Tron 1982. It looked like the future, but critics treated it like a gimmick. When this film arrived, it was visually unlike anything audiences had seen. A digital world brought to life with glowing landscapes and computer-generated imagery that felt almost alien. Instead of embracing that leap, critics fixated on what they believed was missing. They called it cold. They called it hollow. They argued that style had replaced substance. The story was dismissed as thin, and the characters were labeled lifeless. But that judgment ignored the context. This film was not trying to follow traditional storytelling rules. It was building a new language. At its core, this is a story about creators losing control of their own systems, about human identity dissolving inside machines. At the time, those ideas felt abstract and distant. Critics could not connect to a world that did not yet exist in their reality. Decades later, that reality has caught up. Digital spaces define modern life. Virtual identity is no longer fiction. The themes that once felt empty now feel predictive. And the visuals that were dismissed as experimental are now recognized as revolutionary. This film did not fail because it lacked depth. It failed because it arrived too early. Critics judged it by the standards of the past instead of the possibilities of the future. Today, it stands as a cornerstone of digital science fiction, a blueprint that others followed long after its release. Number 5. Dune 1984. It was labeled a failure almost immediately. Confusing, overloaded, impossible to follow. Critics did not hesitate. They saw a film buried under its own ambition and walked away. But that reaction says more about expectation than execution. This was never meant to be simple. It was an attempt to translate one of the most complex science fiction worlds ever written into a visual experience. Politics, religion, ecology, power, all colliding inside a single narrative. The density was not a flaw. It was the source material itself. The problem was control. Studio interference stripped away clarity. Entire layers of meaning were compressed or removed. What reached theaters felt fragmented. Audiences were dropped into a universe without enough guidance, and critics blamed the film instead of the compromise. Yet even in that fractured form, something undeniable remained. The scale, the design, the atmosphere. Every frame carried a sense of myth and danger. It felt ancient and futuristic at the same time. That duality stayed with viewers long after the credits ended. Over time, the film has been re-examined not as a failure but as a bold attempt that was never fully realized. Its influence can be seen in later adaptations and in countless science fiction worlds that followed. What critics once called incomprehensible is now seen as uncompromising. This film did not collapse under ambition. It was constrained by it. And what survived is still powerful enough to demand respect decades later. Number 4. Brazil, 1985. This film did not just confuse critics, it challenged them. And for many, that challenge was unwelcome. Early reactions were divided and sometimes hostile. Too strange, too dark, too chaotic. That was the surface reading. But beneath that reaction was discomfort. Set inside a suffocating bureaucratic nightmare, this story refuses to behave like traditional science fiction. It blends absurd humor with relentless dread. It creates a world where logic collapses under paperwork and human life is reduced to error codes and forms. Critics struggle to categorize it, and when they cannot categorize, they often reject. The studio made things worse. Alternate cuts were pushed, the tone was softened in places, the vision was diluted. Critics were not even judging a single definitive version. They were reacting to a fractured presentation of a singular idea. But the core survived. A man trapped inside a system so vast that escape becomes fantasy. Dreams become the only refuge. Reality becomes a prison of routine and control. These ideas were not easy to digest at the time. Now they feel disturbingly accurate. Modern audiences recognize the satire immediately. The exaggeration no longer feels exaggerated, it feels familiar. This film is now regarded as one of the most important dystopian works ever made. Not because it was easy to understand, but because it refused to simplify its vision. Critics did not misunderstand it because it was unclear. They misunderstood it because it was too honest. Number 3. Videodrome, 1983. It disturbed people in ways they could not explain. Critics called it obscene, confusing, even pointless. They focused on the surface because the surface was impossible to ignore. Distorted bodies, violent imagery, reality melting into hallucination. It felt like chaos, but that chaos was the message. This film is not interested in comfort. It is a direct assault on how media reshapes perception. The story follows a man who consumes extreme content and slowly becomes part of it. The line between screen and self dissolves. Identity becomes programmable. Truth becomes unstable. At the time, these ideas felt abstract. Critics saw shock value instead of structure. They dismissed it as excess because they were not ready to confront what it was suggesting. That media does not just influence reality, it rewrites it. Now the film feels almost prophetic. Screens dominate daily life. Information is manipulated. Identity is curated and controlled. The warnings embedded in this story are no longer theoretical. They are visible everywhere. What once seemed incomprehensible is now disturbingly clear. The film was never chaotic. It was precise in its intention. Every unsettling moment was part of a larger design. Critics rejected it because it made them uncomfortable, not because it lacked meaning. Today it stands as one of the most intelligent and unsettling science fiction works ever made. A film that did not predict the future. It exposed it early. Number 2. The Thing, 1982. It arrived at the worst possible time. Audiences wanted hope, critics wanted optimism. Instead, they got paranoia, isolation, total distrust. The reaction was immediate and harsh. Too cold, too bleak, too relentless. That was the judgment. This film traps its characters in a frozen environment where nothing can be trusted, not even the people standing next to you. The threat is invisible because it can become anyone. Identity is no longer fixed. It is a mask waiting to break. That idea alone was enough to unsettle critics who were expecting something more conventional. The practical effects shocked audiences. They were raw and disturbing in a way that felt almost real. Instead of being praised for innovation, the film was criticized for excess. The horror was too intense for its time. But the deeper layer was missed entirely. This is not just a monster story. It is about fear of the unknown, fear of infiltration, fear of losing control over what defines you. The tension builds through silence and suspicion rather than spectacle. Over time, everything changed. The effects became legendary. The atmosphere became iconic. The storytelling became respected for its restraint and intelligence. What critics once rejected as cold is now seen as masterful control. This film did not fail. It simply refused to comfort its audience. And that refusal is exactly what made it timeless. Number 1. Blade Runner, 1982. It should have been an instant classic. Instead, it confused critics and faded at the box office. Reviews were mixed and often dismissive. Too slow, too distant, too obsessed with visuals. That was the consensus. They expected action. They expected clarity. What they got was something far more dangerous. This film does not tell you what to feel. It forces you to sit inside a world where nothing is certain. Humans behave like machines. Machines begin to feel human. The line between creator and creation collapses. Identity becomes a question with no stable answer. That ambiguity frustrated critics who wanted resolution. The pacing was called a flaw. In reality, it was a deliberate choice. The silence, the lingering shots, the endless rain, All of it builds a suffocating atmosphere where time feels distorted. This is not a story you rush through. It is a world you absorb. Multiple versions only added to the confusion. Studio interference altered tone and meaning. Voiceovers simplified what was meant to be complex. Critics judged a compromised version, and the film paid the price. Decades later, the truth is undeniable. This is one of the most influential science fiction films ever made. Its visual language shaped an entire genre. Its themes about memory, identity, and artificial life are more relevant now than ever. What critics once misunderstood as empty is now recognized as profound. This film did not fail to connect. It demanded patience, and only time revealed its true power. Now the question turns to you. Which of these films do you think critics misunderstood the most? And which one still feels ahead of its time even today? Drop your thoughts below. Because sometimes the real story is not the film itself. It is how long it takes the world to finally understand it.